What's up mates, it's Uncle Nightshift again. And it seems like Christmas is around the corner, so although it's completely unrelated, but tonight we're gonna build the Panzerkleinzerstorer. Okay, so let's take a look at the ingredients for this project. The first and most important is obviously the kit, which is made by Amusing Hobby and repacked by Werk, because the Amusing Hobby kit was a limited edition. I was lucky enough to get this kit for free, but normally it costs about 20 euros. Then we have some photo etch details from Voyager, and I just had to get these because they include metal fenders and other cool details. And they're also pretty cheap on eBay. And last but not least, I bought a set of metal tracks from Furul Model. I decided to go with the so-called final pattern with metal cleats instead of rubber pads, as it fits the late war theme of this model. These tracks were quite expensive and I got them from eBay as well. And let me tell you, spending almost 60 euros on this small model sounds like an absolutely insane idea, but here we are. So let's take a look at what's inside the box and you'll quickly see why I bought all this aftermarket bling. Fenders are okay, but they're quite thick, which could be solved by sanding them, but you can't replicate dents on plastic as well as on metal parts. And also the anti-slip pattern is much finer here. Some details will need extra TLC, but let's take a look at the upper hull. The engine deck is supposed to be bolted, which is replicated here, that's okay, but for some reason you can see a weld bead around it. So I will have to address this, because I tend to be quite fussy about such things. The tracks seem okay, mostly, but my main problem is with these longer segments which lack the individual link detail. It should be mostly hidden under the road wheels, but I didn't want to take any chances, so I got myself a bunch of these bad boys. So anyway, let's start by not following the instructions and focus on assembling the hull. A little bit of magic and boom! Okay, there are quite a few issues which I often observe on other kits as well, and that's when the individual armor plates don't connect like they should in real life. This means we need to fill and rescribe them, but let's take it one step at a time. First we must destroy a few details like bolts and weld lines, but don't worry, we'll make them look even better later. Then we can sand each panel so everything sits flush. It's important to be careful and not distort their shape while sanding. Now we can fill every unwanted gap using my favorite Tamiya basic gray putty. While the putty was drying, I decided to build up the side armor extensions because they don't match the thickness of the plate. They're okay at the back of the vehicle, but here they are almost paper thin. We'll get back to this right after we're done sanding the putty, which should be already dry. If you apply it in thin layers, you'll be able to sand it smooth in about 10 or 15 minutes. Now we can cut those plastic cards to our desired shape. Here it's also important to give the cement enough time to evaporate, because otherwise the plastic will be like melted cheese. At this point I decided to address those panel lines at the top of the vehicle. I filled them all with Tamiya epoxy putty, that's the one I use for weld beads, which we'll make in this video as well, but now I'm using it to fill the panel lines. Then while the putty was still soft, I pressed in a new line, which is A, thinner and thus more in scale, and B, doesn't have that weld bead detail at the bottom. If I ever need to use this method again, I'll let the putty dry first and then use a scribing tool and a straight edge, because this result is a little irregular in some places, but I hope it won't be too evident. And of course, after it dried, I removed the excess with a hobby blade and polished everything so it'll be nice and smooth. My next task was rescribing each armor plate. This was fairly easy in most places, and more difficult in others. But what I wanted to talk about is this section. As you can see, the weld line goes like this, but the side extension down here means it should go like this. And that wouldn't make any sense, unless there's some kind of intersection. Let me just show you. Let's place it somewhere above the fender. Now it can follow down this line. And then continue here. Now it actually makes sense, because interlocking armor plates were a common thing on German tanks. However, I didn't add a weld bead on this edge, but instead I rounded it with a sanding sponge to make it look like a single armor plate which was bent. Something like on a King Tiger turret. Then I just drilled out the gun optics, and the model is now ready for the fun stuff, aka adding armor textures and weld beads. As usual, I started with the armor texture, and if you'd like to learn more about it, then consider yourself lucky, because I made a detailed tutorial about this technique, which you can watch if you click the link on your screen, or you'll find it in the description down below. The only difference to my standard approach is that I made sure to apply a very light coat of putty, and I also sanded it quite a lot, so it left just a very faint texture here and there. After all, this is supposed to be a light tank made from thin armor plates. Now I wanted to take a break from texturing, so I cleaned up the running gear. This was super easy and fast, and it was a nice change to not suffer during this process. You might notice that I didn't add any damage to the rubber parts, and... well, that's because after looking up quite a few photos of different 251 running gears and even rusty old relics desperate for restoration, I haven't seen a single road wheel with damaged rubber, and I found it to be a pretty curious little detail. And I was also lazy. The suspension swing arms are extremely loose, so I had to fix them in place with glue, and while they were still movable, I aligned them with a straight edge. I also decided to make the suspension sit a little deeper in its travel to give the tank a more tired look. Okay, back to texturing. I continued by adding the flame cut marks, and again, I described this in striking detail in that tutorial I mentioned before, and again, the only difference is that this time I kept them quite faint, as those armor plates are more delicate. Now I mixed a small blob of Tamiya epoxy putty, rolled it into a very thin noodle, and started welding. I also have a very detailed tutorial about this technique, so check it out if you're not familiar with it. Light armor usually means weld beads are also not massive, so yeah, it's important to roll the putty into a very thin noodle and press it firmly into the groove. Then I textured them with my homemade welding tool, and I also described this process in that video I mentioned. And this is your standard single bevel weld bead. But I also did something new, and that something is a so-called multiple pass weld. And for this I have made a simple tool from a piece of sprue, which I sanded basically into a sharp screwdriver, and I used that to punch multiple random lines along the weld bead. I'll explain this method in more detail in the future when I build a more suitable model for it. But anyway, the model is now textured and welded, and oh boy, it's quite a difference from how it looked at the beginning. But it also took about 8 hours, so yeah, it might not be for everyone. Anyway, I had some issues with the wheels. They fit very loosely and their alignment is all over the place. There's also quite a lot of them, so I wanted to solve both problems with one solution. This time I was inspired by a fellow YouTuber Bayin Wu and his Tiger 1, where he glued the wheels together for easier painting. So I did exactly that, first with liquid cement, which allowed me to align them, and then with super glue, a lot of super glue, to make sure they'll stay in place and won't fall apart later. And boom! The only difference is that I decided to keep those 3 outer wheels removable so I can get behind them more easily while painting and weathering, and also the entire alignment thing happens on the inner wheels, so it's not an issue. But yeah, now they are held firmly in place, are easily removed from the suspension, and are perfectly straight. Now I wanted to have some fun with the tracks. They are tiny, and each link is made from 2 parts. These need to be glued together using superglue, but they fit together like Lego blocks, and the assembly is quite easy and straightforward. And before you know it, you have an entire army of track links. I usually don't use the provided brass wire because it's hard to cut. Instead, I prefer copper wire, which you can cut easily with a hobby blade, and here's why. I always make a simple jig from a few pieces of plastic card which I use to cut, or rather chop, lengths of wire which are the exact length I need. Thanks to this, the wire doesn't protrude out of the assembled track links, which is often the only visible downside of full model tracks compared to, let's say, Master Club. Et voila! One evening and the tracks are assembled. Unfortunately, they don't fit around the kit sprockets, so we have to use the metal ones provided with the tracks. These are, however, too wide and don't align with the road wheels. This means we have to remove a significant amount of material from the inside, but luckily white metal is very soft and it can be done in no time. The metal sprockets are a bit wobbly, but I'll superglue them in place once the model is painted. Overall, these tracks are a huge improvement. Also, the track tension is just right and I'm very happy with them. Next, I decided to make a few details which I destroyed previously. Mainly these huge bolts which were slightly distorted in the kit. And I also made these crude blocks or something which were inspired by a hetzer. And I think they were used to restrict the movement of the gun, I guess. Next, I attached these fender braces and I made extra sure they were all aligned because again, they had a slightly wobbly fit. And now it's time to solder those metal fenders. These are overall very pleasant to work with. They are easy to remove, easy to clean up, easy to bend, and have quite simple shapes. Soldering them was also surprisingly simple and enjoyable, and I originally wanted to make this segment into a separate video, but then I wasn't confident about the results, mainly the quality of the footage. So yeah, maybe next time. But overall, I think the footage shows the process clearly enough and I didn't make any accidental hiccups. The only slightly difficult thing is to keep the soldering clean while attaching the tread plates and the braces, because it would be hard to clean those parts later. But the best thing about metal fenders is battle damage. Here it's vital to have the inner side of the fender firmly held in a bending tool. We need to have this side completely straight because otherwise we wouldn't be able to attach the fender to the model properly. And holding it like this will ensure it will stay straight. You might also notice there's something wrong with my pliers. I superglued pieces of plastic inside their jaws so I won't damage the outer lip of the fender. After washing each fender in soapy water, it's time to attach them to the model. First, it's important to align them properly, and here we can take our time and bend the braces as well, so they'll fit the damaged outer portion of the fender. When everything fits as it should, use a lot of superglue to hold everything firmly in place. Don't be shy, it won't be visible and it'll most likely be covered in mud later, so better be safe now than sorry later when the model is painted and it starts falling apart. Oh yeah! Now it's time to attach the other details like engine grills, and here I'm using my favorite black superglue to both hold them in place and fill any gaps between them and the hull. And this is it, the superglue everyone keeps asking about. The manufacturer is a French company MX Bond. When it was fully cured, I removed the excess with debonder. This process looks almost like removing excess wash with enamel thinner. But anyway, this is the debonder I'm using. It's the only one I found to be working as it should so far, and it's made in Czech Republic by Mr. Dosek. If you're interested, just search Dosek debonder and hopefully you'll find a store that could send them to your location. Anyway, the back plate doesn't have many details and most of them are easy to assemble. The only modification was to drill out the exhaust pipe because its walls were overly thick. Okay, I wasn't totally enthusiastic about the bolt detail on the top of the vehicle, so I decided to enhance it a little bit. First I made each hole slightly deeper, but just barely, not too much. And then I dug out my old set of photo-etched bolt heads, which are unfortunately the cross type, but I think it's better than nothing. and I placed them into each hole. I believe this improved the overall surface detail a lot. I also wanted to make the surface more interesting by adding grab handles on those few hatches that are there. So I used a grab handle bending tool from RP Tools, then cut them to length, carefully measured and drilled out their holes, and I used a piece of styrene as a spacer to make sure every handle will be the same height. The lifting hooks on the sides of the hull were made from a thicker wire bent over a toothpick. This time I had to cut them to the same length, and I also bent them slightly outward in my photo edge bending tool. Then I added a few weld beads around smaller parts like the mounts for the ventilator and periscopes. The final details were too small and hard to film, but the first detail was the headlight, which I made from a spare part from a Dragon kit combined with a resin base which came from the Voyager photo edge set for this model, and a photo edge mounting plate. And the electric wire was made from a wire. I also salvaged a few engineering tools from a Ryefield model's Tiger 1 and combined them with photo-edged clamps and mounting hardware which was in the Voyager set. Basically they give you the clamps, but you need to find the tool somewhere else. Or use them empty. That's like up to you. The final and last detail was to make a few bolts from a piece of tin foil. This is the trick which I already demonstrated in my KV220-2 restoration video, and I used them to add some extra detail on fenders. And that's pretty much it, my mates. I think it's a pretty interesting little tank hunter. And although the kit itself is a bit simplified and rough around the edges, with some photo edge, metal tracks and TLC, you can build it into a, dare I say, unique model. Painting it will be quite interesting because I haven't done a German camouflage in more than a decade. So yeah, make sure you won't miss the next episode. And if you enjoyed this video, let me know by giving it a like and leaving a comment. And if you're interested in some extra content, consider joining these guys over at my Patreon page. You'll be able to message me directly, you also get early videos and almost daily blog style updates from every model I work on. And wow, I mean, as I'm recording this, we have just hit 40,000 subscribers and I don't even know what to say. When I started this channel 10 months ago, I was hoping to reach 1,000 in a year, and yeah, I think it's just insane. I mean, you guys are absolutely amazing, and sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. And hey, it seems like we have Christmas in 4 days, huh? That's interesting, so Merry Christmas, guys. I wish you tons of models, but most importantly, peaceful holidays spent with your families and loved ones. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you mates in the next one. Cheers!